Today I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been involved in, and colleagues, of course, over the last few decades. I guess it makes me sound older, in fact, that I am probably, but anyway, never mind. Let's crack on. Now, many of you will be doubtless aware of the sort of the background to archaeology publicly. That many people look at it as sort of an Indiana Jones type of thing. But recent work has shown that actually some of the more extremely exciting discoveries in archaeology have been in labs like this. This ancient DNA field has exploded. We've got the ability to extract DNA from very ancient samples. In fact, the record was broken again a couple of weeks ago. And I think very excitingly as well, we've got the ability now to also date to extract DNA from sediments, as you can see here on the right-hand side. So we're living in the golden age of exploration into human origins in particular, by virtue of a combination and a collaboration between archaeologists and scientists that is, I think, really opening up new areas of data and excitement in terms of finally getting to grips with what's happening in the Paleolithic. So it's a great time to be working in this field, in this area. One of the reasons for this is because we have increasing knowledge now that this field is much more complex than we hitherto thought. We have a number of different species of human that have been sharing the Earth 50,000 years ago. So I just thought I'd give you a very brief outline of this. Most of you will be aware that Homo sapiens, like us, evolved originally in Africa. That's what the fossil evidence and the genetic evidence is telling us. And then at some point, groups of Homo sapiens moved outwards into Eurasia, into the old world. We don't quite know when, but it looks as though there were periodic movements out of Africa, including very early ones, maybe up to 160, 170,000 years ago or older, and then 120,000 years ago, and then later at about 50 to 60,000 years ago. And it's my feeling that this happened in a punctuated way, perhaps climate mediated. When these early Homo sapiens moved out into these areas, they met people that they shared a common ancestry with, some several hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The most famous and well-known of these are the Neanderthals, of course, who were occupying Europe, the Near East, areas of Central Asia, up until their disappearance. Latterly, in 2003 and 2019, I should say, we have evidence from even more interesting people that were discovered on the island of Flores in the Philippines. And these diminutive humans, we don't know very much about them and the material culture, nor when they disappeared, but nonetheless, they add to this idea that we have large numbers of humans living at this time. It's possible that even Homo erectus may have encountered early Homo sapiens moving into island Southeast Asia, where we find recent work that suggests that they may have survived as late as 60 to 100,000 years ago. And then finally, for most interest to me, the discovery in 2010 of the Denisovans in the Denisova cave in Siberia, and then more recently, a second site on the Tibetan plateau in Western China, throws another interesting hominin into the mix. So this story of our genus, Homo, is starting to look like not just a simple story of change through time and the evolution of our lineage. It's starting to look more like a kind of a Middle Earth, if you like, that we should be looking at it in terms of groups of humans that overlapped with one another in different parts of the world, and certainly it was an extremely complex situation where we could have had 7, 8, perhaps even more different kinds of humans. And from this, a great number of research questions arise. And something I've been interested in is, what happened to these groups, and when did we encounter them? Did we ever meet them? And if we did, what happened? Did we exchange genes? Did we exchange ideas, aspects of cultural adaptation? And when did all this happen? As a dating specialist, this is foremost in my mind, because it's so important to establish a time frame over which these events took place, such that we were able to talk on a common framework. Because if we can't do that, then we're really playing guessing games as to what exactly happened in the Paleolithic past. Now, this assumes a great deal of importance, particularly in terms of this idea of exchange and interaction, because for many years it's been thought that, at least in the western part of Eurasia, where the archaeological record is very detailed by virtue of many decades of archaeological excavation and a great deal of funding and science being thrown at things, it was thought until very recently that the earliest Homo sapiens to arrive into this area were the Aurignacians. They brought with them, from about 43,000 BP, aspects of material culture that were considered to be much more advanced symbolically and technologically than the Neanderthals that had been living there. And this was the prevailing paradigm. It still is amongst some people for many, many years. We see in the archaeological record the appearance of significant numbers of ornaments, such as these, made from a variety of different types of materials. The predominant type being shell ornaments, this constitutes about half of the types of ornaments that we have in the archaeological record at this time. We have teeth, different varieties, more than 20 different species of mammal teeth that were used by these people as decorative mechanism, including human teeth and even a shark tooth and some ancient fossils, etc. as well. And these are important because they're indicative of what we sort of euphemistically term, I suppose, modern behavior. And that's because they have a symbolic resonance. They ethno-linguistically have been held by anthropologists to mark a sort of a representational aspects of in-group identity, perhaps fixing social boundaries and group boundaries, forging network linkages between different groups and so on. And so their appearance marks a very significant change in the archaeological record. We now know that these changes mark considerable earlier periods in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa and Southern Africa. But for the purpose of exploring the relationships between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, particularly this time, there are very interesting appearance in the archaeological record. The questions have always been, were Aurignacians and were Homo sapiens the first humans into this area? And were they the first people to bear this type of behavioral adaptation and technology? And this has led to a great debate, as many of you know, for many decades, as to the capabilities of Neanderthals and Neanderthal populations in Europe and Eurasia at the same time. This is a quote from a recent article, and well, comparatively recent, in 2003. Almost certainly the Neanderthals succumbed because they wielded culture less effectively. And this is the kind of the crux of this question and this issue. And dating is central to it. For many years, we've had bitter debates about the makers of certain archaeological stone tool industries in Europe. I guess the most famous one would be the Châtelperronian. Were these ornaments, were these symbolic ornaments made by Neanderthals, as the archaeology at this particular site of Assy-sur-Cure suggests, or was it the fault, was it the influence of incoming Homo sapiens that led to the adoption of these types of objects? Were they made by humans? Did this material post-depositionally move and migrate through these layers at the site of Assy-sur-Cure? These are bitter debates that go on and on and on. So in order to try and work on these issues, from my perspective as a chronologist, I've been working to understand two things. One, when did the latest Neanderthals disappear? When were they present in these parts of the world? And secondly, when did the earliest modern humans arrive? Because the answers to some of these questions at least can be partially answered by looking at whether they had a degree of overlap or not, or whether humans arrived and Neanderthals already disappeared, for example, or whether there was a short or brief overlap. These are very interesting and important questions that can be answered with high resolution chronologies. So a lot of my work has been focused on dating archaeological sites in this part of the world where we see this evidence on the ground. And so here is a map showing some of the sites that I and my colleagues have worked on over the last few years to try and date the final Neanderthals and the earliest anatomically modern or Homo sapiens humans coming into this area between, let's say, 50 to 35,000 years ago. So we looked at around 40 sites which had evidence for Neanderthal stone tool industries, the Mousterian, the Châtelperronian, and so on, and sometimes had evidence physically for Neanderthals. And so we obtained more than 200 AMS radiocarbon dates from these sites linked to these occupations, and we were able to build chronometric Bayesian models which allow us to look at these important boundary points which mark the end of different techno-complexes, lithic techno-complexes. A slide shows a sort of summary of how this eventually works. And these, you can see these probability distributions here. These represent the final Neanderthal dates for these sites on the previous diagram in cases where we have enough data, enough radiocarbon dates. And what we did then was we fixed a probability distribution to the end of that, and we worked out that the latest Neanderthal sites and the latest Neanderthals therefore dated between 41 and around 39,000 years ago. That was the demise of Neanderthals. So what then of these earliest Homo sapiens? When did they arrive? Well, there's been a lot of work on this recently that is very important because, of course, it tells us a great deal about the potential overlap. In 2011, a very important paper was published in Nature, which reinvestigated a site in the very southern part of Italy, in the boot of Italy, called the Grotta del Cavallo, which is here on this arrow. You can see it. It was excavated in the 1960s and 70s. It produced some evidence for personal ornaments like these, and dentalium shells, and some very interesting types of lithic stone tools, these very curious crescent-shaped artifacts. It was associated with Neanderthals for many years because of the identifications of two teeth that were thought by paleoanthropologists then to be Neanderthal in origin. Later, Stefano Benazzi from then Vienna University reanalyzed these teeth, and using geometric morphometrics showed that actually they weren't Neanderthals, they were anatomically modern human teeth, which then changed the designation of this particular site and the stone tool industry of the Aleutian, not to be Neanderthals, but to be anatomically modern human. And this was interesting and very important because when we dated it, when Caterina Duca dated it in our lab, we were able to show that it was much earlier than the Aurignacian. And so when we put this data together with the previous slide I showed you on the latest Neanderthals, what we find is that the earliest modern human evidence is actually earlier than the latest Neanderthal evidence. It dates to around 45 to 43,000 years ago, which means that there's an overlap between these two groups of several thousand years. In fact, we quantified it to be between 2,500 to 5,000 years of overlap. And it gets even more interesting because recently there was another paper that was published in Nature in 2020 by Hublin et al., which showed that another site in Bulgaria where Homo sapiens remains were found dates even earlier than that, potentially up to 47,000 years ago, which gives a much greater degree of overlap between modern humans and Neanderthals of perhaps up to 7,000 years. So this changes a great deal about what we know in terms of the potential interaction between these groups, because it raises all sorts of possible implications that they may have had a great deal more contact than we thought. And this, as we know, very famously has been confirmed with ancient DNA. So we know now, by virtue of the Neanderthal Genome Project, which was published in 2010 by Green et al., that humans and Neanderthals interbred with one another, and that we can carry people outside of Africa carry more, but people inside Africa do carry too Neanderthal DNA. And it averages around 2 to 2.5% right across this great breadth of the world, from the west of Europe all the way to Melanesia and to the Eastern Pacific. And so this, of course, proof positive that there was interaction between these two populations. And this is the great contribution of initially this new surge in ancient genomics. So as well as this, we've also had a bit of a renaissance in terms of what we understand to be the capabilities of Neanderthals and Neanderthal populations. So far from it being a case of modern humans sweeping in with these symbolically laden artifacts and objects that nobody else had in this area before, it looks as though actually Neanderthals were quite capable of doing similar things, not in such great numbers, but certainly we're learning more and more about their capabilities almost every month. This paper that came out more than a decade ago was a very important investigation into this, because it showed that Neanderthals in Iberia were using pigments and colorants and piercing shells in the same way that other people were doing this in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa and in the Levant. At Bruniquel Cave in France, evidence that Neanderthals were comfortable perhaps with looking deep inside cave complexes in the darkness and making, in this case, shelters or constructions that date to more than 160,000 years ago. Previously, this was seen as the exclusive preserve of Homo sapiens. Whilst inside these caves, they weren't just seemingly building structures like that, they were also apparently producing artworks. This is recently published in Science by Hoffman et al. We looked at these previously and assumed that they were authored by Homo sapiens. But the dating of small crusts of carbonate overlying some of these artworks in sites in Spain showed that actually they were made a minimum of 64 to 65, sometimes even older, 1,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens were in the Iberian Peninsula. And therefore they must have been made by Neanderthals. Neanderthals also seem to have an interest in the kind of ornamentation that, Homo sapiens brought in later. So there's evidence that they were interested in large birds of prey. For example, here's some eagle talons that were found at the site of Krapina in Croatia. And Radovcic et al. Showed that there was evidence for working and perhaps suspending these objects around the neck of a Neanderthal. These are more than 100,000 years of age. Cut marks here at the tips of these talons of these large eagles. In other sites, for example, in Italy, we find that Neanderthals are making cut marks on large birds of prey, such as this falcon, on areas of the bird which aren't the meat-bearing parts at all. In fact, they're closer to the wings, and it's been suggested that these cut marks on these large birds could have been because the Neanderthals were focusing on feathers. They've been found at more than 16 sites where Neanderthals are present. And so we now think that perhaps Neanderthals are engaging in this kind of interesting behavior. And it's tempting to think that this long period of overlap might have facilitated more than just a genetic exchange between these groups. It could have perhaps been that they were engaging in some kind of exchange of ideas and cultural developments and technological developments too. Although I have to say that it's not until much later in the sort of 40,000s of years BP that this type of behavior seems to explode into the archaeological record. But perhaps that's because we haven't been looking in the right places, and perhaps more archaeological research will throw up other examples in which we can then plot a sort of a growing increase rather than a sudden explosion. There's still, of course, a lot more work to do, and the Paleolithic is very patchy, but nonetheless, things have really changed in the last decade in this field in terms of understanding the relationships between these two groups, what happened when they met. And as I say, we've gone a great deal of work has been done in the last few years to show this. Now I want to switch to the Denisovans, because these groups also have a major contribution to make in terms of understanding what happened when Homo sapiens emerged into this Eurasian continent and what happened when they did. The site of Denisova Cave is located about halfway across Eurasia. Here's a picture of Russia at the bottom, where there's some small red boxes. And it was first investigated in the 1980s by Russian archaeologists, but later large excavation teams at the Russian Academy of Sciences began to work here. And you can see down at the bottom of the Anui Valley here in the Russian Altai, you can see these little houses which form the basis of the Denisova base camp, which is now under excavation for several months of the year outside the winter, which is a very difficult time to be here. The site itself is here. You can see the little path that leads up to it, and the cave is just in the crevice there. When you look back down the river from the north, from the south, you can see that it's a pinch point in the valley. So the Denisova cave site would have been a pretty attractive one, I think, for hunters during the period from about 250,000 years ago, when human groups seem to have been occupying the site. It's a picture of the pleasant lower floor of the valley with some of the chalets that people can stay in when they visit the site, and a big kitchen area here and a restaurant. It's a very, very well appointed place, rather nice place to be. This is the Anui River that you can see here that bubbles about 20 meters below the site of Denisova, which is up a slight incline. And you can see it here. It's one of the few caves in the region, actually. There aren't many caves in this area. It's not greatly limestone rich. And inside, it's a large cavern. You come in through this entranceway here, and there are 3 chambers in the Denisova cave. The main or central chamber, where excavations first began, the east chamber, where a lot of the human remains and the very exciting material has been excavated, and the south chamber, which is currently under excavation now. This is a picture looking down into the east chamber. It's quite a narrow chamber, as you can see, and it's been excavated to the base at the bottom of this part of the chamber now. And here we are in 2013 visiting to take samples for radiocarbon dating. And just up here behind where we're standing is where some of the very important human remains were found, including this tiny finger phalanx. It's a tiny piece of bone that was originally sent for DNA analysis to Leipzig. It's part of a larger bone, this 5th digit phalanx. Most of the bone was sent to another lab for analysis, but unfortunately it seems to have disappeared. No one can locate it. But this tiny bone here, weighing about 25 milligrams, was analyzed by Svante Paavo's team, and it produced in 2010 2 landmark papers, which showed initially on the basis of mitochondrial DNA, and secondly on the basis of a initially low coverage nuclear genome, that there was a new unknown hominin group in Eastern Eurasia, which had been called the Denisovans. And that's because there's no haplotype, there's no stratotype of the Denisovans yet, because the remains are very fragmentary, as you'll see in a second. And another jaw-dropping piece of work, as many of you will now know, is that it turned out that modern-day humans derive ancestry just like Neanderthals from Denisovans, particularly pronounced in the eastern part of Eurasia in Melanesia, but also in Eastern Asia, South Asia, Japan as well, but less so from the west of Eurasia. In fact, virtually zero, except with a couple of odd exceptions in places like, for example, Finland. When we look at the stratigraphy of the Denisova cave, the 2 main areas we've got, the 2 main areas that we have, the main chamber and the east chamber, there's no easy way to stratigraphically correlate across from these 2 locations because they're not connected. And so we don't have a very good idea of the cross correlation, but broadly speaking, there's a Holocene layer, and then there's early Upper Paleolithic layers from 11 to 9. And then below that is the Middle Paleolithic, going back to layer 22.3, which, as I say, is dating to about 250 to 300,000 years ago. Here are pictures of some of the lithics and the stone tool technology that you'll see at the site. It's Middle Paleolithic dominated, but up in the layers 11.4 to 11.1 in the east chamber, you get the first indications of the initial Upper Paleolithic and the Upper Paleolithic. So you see the arrival and the development of some of the same types of symbolic ornaments and artifacts that you find far, far to the west. In fact, in both chambers, you find a similar thing. Another question is who made these ornaments? I mean, this is a big, big point of debate. Initially, many of us were thinking that it must be modern humans, but bearing in mind what I've just discussed in terms of Neanderthal capabilities, Russian colleagues think that it's more likely, just as likely that it could be that Denisovans made this. And that's because the remains of Homo sapiens have yet to be actually recovered from Denisova cave. It's only, in this part of the site anyway, it's only Denisovan remains that we find. So the parsimonious explanation is that it may be Denisovans that are making these personal ornaments here. although that does have to be tested. There are very, very few remains of humans from Denisova Cave. The largest one recently is this unpublished piece of a cranium. It's the biggest one, but the others are all tiny, single teeth. The phalanx that I mentioned before, they're all tiny remains. And so a lot of the work that we've been involved with has been spent exploring whether or not we can recover and extract, find any more human remains from the site. The problem is that 95% of the bones from Denisova Cave are fragmented to such an extent that we can't identify what they are to species. And so in order to try and address this, we have been using a method called ZOOMS, which stands for Zooarchaeology by Mass Spectrometry. It's a method of looking at the protein sequences in tiny bones like these. You can see how big these bones are. That's my thumb there for a scale. Thousands and thousands of these tiny little bones. And yet we know that within these bags of bones, there must be human remains as well as all of the animal bones lurking. And so in 2015, we started a project using this ZOOMS method that was developed here in the University of York by Michael Buckley and Matthew Collins. And we used it to do fast throughput of bones like these from Denisova Cave. And this woman here, Samantha Brown, who was our first MSc student working on this, she took on this project. And this project has now been continuing under Katerina Duka's work. But basically what we do is we take a bunch of these bones and we take a small sample of them, tiny bit of the bone, we put it into these small tubes and we archive the rest. And then we extract the peptides from these bones and we can use the fingerprint of these peptides to identify hominin remains. And so far, this is a slightly out of date slide, we've analyzed now more than 10,000 bones. But in this case, we found new hominin remains. So these are hominins that have been identified now. Some of them are Denisovans, some of them are Neanderthal. Some of them, unfortunately, don't have any DNA in. We're able to date them. We're able to, therefore, add to the corpus of human remains that are coming from this really important site. Now, the most exciting remain that we found to this day was the first one, Denisova 11. This was the one that was found by Sam in her MSc dissertation work. And what we found when DNA was extracted from this initially was that its mitochondria told us that it was a Neanderthal. But when the nuclear genome was extracted, it turned out that half of the DNA was Neanderthal and the other half was Denisovan. And it was the first hybrid species remain that we found in archaeology. So it was a 50-50. It was a first generation offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. And this was a really jaw-dropping discovery because it brought home to us the fact that these humans who were living and perhaps sometimes overlapping with one another were interbreeding with each other. And this was a sort of a kind of jaw-dropping discovery because of the fact that it was a first generation, not somebody that had some ancestry in their genome. Anyway, we've continued to work on this at Denisova Cave. And as you can see from this slide, we've now added considerably to the number of human remains that have been found. So instead of just having these numbers, we've now added more. In fact, there are now more human remains that have been found from Denisova using ZOOMS than have been found using archaeology. And what is this telling us? Well, it's telling us something very important for our understanding of the Paleolithic. Not only are we finding these human bones that can be sequenced genetically, but we're also using sediment DNA work, now getting sediment DNA from these sediments. So where you see these little trowels of different color, this indicates Denisovan DNA has been recovered, and this one indicates Neanderthal DNA has been recovered. So for example, from the main east chamber, I should say, if you look up closely, we can now see that we've got Denisovans here in layer 15, and then Neanderthals above in layer 14. And then we've got above that Neanderthals, the hybrid bone, Denisovans above that, then Neanderthals again, then Denisovans again. And then above that, we think probably we've got modern humans, although the DNA evidence has not yet been published. We found this bone, Denisova 14, but we weren't able to extract DNA from it. But nonetheless, what we're seeing is an interdigitation, interstratification of these various groups as they occupied Denisova Cave. Sometimes they must have been there at the same time because of the fact that we find the remains of Denny, the Denisova 11 remain. So it's a very complicated picture. But what I think is happening is that between Western Eurasia and Eastern Eurasia, where we have Neanderthals in one and Denisovans in the other, this is a part of an overlap zone where we get an overlap periodically where either one or the other group are there. But for the most part, they're separated geographically from one another. We've managed to use a novel Bayesian approach to date these tiny human bones as well. It's very difficult to date material beyond 50,000 years unless you're using techniques like uranium series. We have dated one sample using uranium series, but these are dates that we've generated using dates from the sediments, using optical stimulated luminescence, dates from uranium series, but most importantly, dates from the stratigraphic sequence, as well as dates using mitochondrial DNA mutation rate estimates. And so what you can see here is that the Denisovans, here we've got them back to 160 to 190,000 years ago at the bottom, perhaps even earlier. And then the latest ones we've got just coming up to 50,000 years ago. And we also have Neanderthals present at around 100 to 120,000 years ago. Denny, the Denisova hybrid, we date to about between the two. And then above that, we have possibly Homo sapiens here between 45 to 50,000 years ago, although that's not confident because we don't have DNA. We're inferring that it might be there. So again, we have these questions of who made these artifacts and ornaments. Was it Denisovans, or was it Homo sapiens, or could it even have been late surviving Neanderthals? At the moment, it's very difficult to say because we have a potential small amount of mixing in these key layers. But it looks as though we can be more confident about when modern humans get into these areas, because we have new dates from modern humans from a site called Ustashim, which put Homo sapiens, at this area at around 45,000 years ago. These tooth pendants date to perhaps a little bit earlier, although it's very difficult to be sure because of the limits of the radiocarbon calibration curve. And we also have bone points, which are also very early. In fact, these objects are the earliest directly dated examples in Eurasia. So, in conclusion, I've given you a very broad overview of some of the main questions that, the main issues that I'm interested in and my team is interested in looking at. First of all, some broad conclusions though. Homo sapiens emerged from Africa and then reintroduced themselves to people that they shared a common ancestry with, albeit more than 400,000 years ago. These distant cousins in Eurasia were mainly Neanderthals and also Denisovans. We've now established that there was quite a considerable period of overlap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens of the order of millennia. In fact, in my book, I'm going to be talking about even earlier evidence for Homo sapiens in Western Europe. And this raises considerably the likelihoods of genetic and perhaps even cultural exchange too, although the latter is very difficult to prove. In the eastern part of Eurasia, Homo sapiens would have and did encounter Denisovans. And we now know from population genetic studies of modern groups living in these areas that there were at least two different Denisovan populations. It's tempting to think where these might have been located. We know that Denisova Cave had Denisovans. Whether or not they were there up until after 40,000 years ago, we don't know yet. But it's looking more likely that there were a Denisovan population east of Wallace's line in the islands of Melanesia. And I think also in eastern Eurasia and perhaps China and the Far East, there was Denisovan population too. At Denisova Cave, we get an insight, I think unlike no other, because of the preservation state of the material there and the deep stratification. We get an interesting insight into the occupational history of the site. So we can see that there was clear interstratification of hominins of different type. There was periods where there were Neanderthals there were periods when there were Denisovans there, and sometimes they were there at the same time. Humans, Homo sapiens, are proving a little bit more difficult to find, but there is a paper that is hopefully going to appear soon, which may shed further light on that. And finally, the big question regarding the makers of these ornaments in the bone industry Well, the jury is still out to a large extent in the eastern part of Eurasia. In the western part of Eurasia too, there is a lot of controversy, but I think that we're getting more confident about trying to identify on a more fine-grained level exactly what happened. I think that new scientific methods such as the sediment DNA work, high-precision radiocarbon, and other dating techniques are all making a contribution. So slowly but surely, we're starting to get to the basis of this. But it's quite possible that we could be looking at, hybrid populations and different groups of people that could have been doing different things at different times. So it's getting more and more complicated the more we look into it. That's just the nature of archaeology in the Paleolithic. Now, Shreya mentioned very kindly this book of mine that's going to be appearing this week. It comes out in the UK on Thursday and in other countries slightly later. But some of the work that I've been talking about appears in this. And so if you do eventually get it, I do hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions following it, by all means, get in touch with me. This is my email address. This is my Twitter handle. I'd love to hear from you. And finally, I'd just like to thank all the people that I work with. The team of the Paleocron, which is a big project that I've been working on for the last 6 or 7 years. Our colleagues in the Max Planck, who do all the genetics work, amazing work, and also the funding that helps to allow us to do this work as well. And I'd like to thank you also very much for listening in. Thanks.